Hello everyone! Today's video is another viewer request that was posted in the last video's comments. If you have a particular topic that you'd like me to address, feel free to add it in the comments below and I'll see what kind of response I can come up with. I found that in the short campaign I'm running, it's hard to make things fun and seem fair between players themselves. Specifically, I'm running a level 5 campaign and have an 18 AC high health cleric that does crazy damage and has lots of spells, but also a rogue who seems to have nothing to do in combat but shoot and is less effective at it. Trying to make the actual play fun for different classes and strengths is an issue. I have found some things to remedy like this, like giving interesting items suited for rogues or having obstacles and traps where a rogue can really shine, but I don't want to exclude the other players during that. I'm not sure if there really is advice other than just talking with the players and maybe not overthinking it too much, but I would love to hear your feedback. I don't want to make any player the favorite, but not doing anything makes it seem unfair for those who are less effective at combat. This campaign is combat oriented, so roleplay is not too big of an issue. When I first read this comment, the immediate thing that came to mind was, man, this DM is really feeling the martial-caster divide. So, what do we do about it? Hi, I'm John, and this is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming. And today, we're going to talk about balancing out the player experience with different classes in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Let's get into it. Before we can offer possible solutions, we first need to understand the complex problems that are creating the current frustrating outcome. Let's start by identifying marshals and casters. In general, a marshal is a character that primarily attacks with a weapon, like a fighter swinging a sword, a ranger using a bow, or even a monk hitting with their fists. A caster, on the other hand, primarily uses magic. While they may have some basic attack cantrips, like a wizard's firebolt or a cleric's sacred flame, they usually also have higher level spells that they can use a limited number of times. When new players come to the game and read through the classes in the player's handbook, there's usually two big things that stand out to differentiate these categories. Martial characters, like fighters and barbarians, tend to have higher hit points, better armor proficiencies, and simpler strategies. In combat, they usually use their action to make a weapon attack roll in order to damage a target. Casters, on the other hand, usually have less hit points and not as many armor proficiencies, meaning that they're not as tough as their martial peers. However, they're far more complex to play. A casting player has to prepare different spells and be able to choose from a big list. When they cast a leveled spell, they have to use up a spell slot, so resource management is just part of the playstyle. And a lot of casters also have complex supplementary features, like a druid's wild shape or a bard's bardic inspiration, giving them additional things that they have to track. The theoretical balance is that even though their spells can have a huge effect on the battle, they have to be careful about how they use them, because if a caster runs out of spell slots, they tend to be more vulnerable than marshals. Well, theoretically at least. In practice, this dichotomy rarely exists. And the situation that was posed by this topic's requester is actually fairly common. The caster, the cleric, has a higher AC, which is why the commenter mentioned it. The rogue, which is billed as a damage-dealing class, has a hard time keeping up. This is the harsh reality of the martial-caster divide. Casters who are able to invest in a full spell slot progression can often pick up things like armor proficiency and higher hit points that are supposed to differentiate martials much more easily than the other way around. Even if you take a subclass that gives spell casting, like Eldritch Knight or Arcane Trickster, or a martial tries multi-classing into a spellcasting class, oftentimes they won't be keeping up with the raw damage dealing potential, spell power, and survivability of cleverly built casting characters. But I don't want to just make this claim and assume that you'll believe me. Let's take a look at some math, as well as this specific rogue cleric example, in order to see the martial caster divide in action. To start, D&D is an incredibly dynamic game. It's difficult to draw helpful data-driven conclusions because, at the end of the day, the DM can always adjust different values in a monster's stat block, which can seriously impact the underlying math. That being said, in an earlier comment, this topic's requester said that they were a new DM. So to help demonstrate this point, one of the first assumptions I'm going to make is that this DM is using official first-party stat blocks from sources like the Monster Manual or Mordenkainen Presents Monsters of the Multiverse. Since it wasn't mentioned, I'm also going to assume that neither this level 5 rogue or level 5 cleric are multiclassed. As the commenter didn't point out their specific subclasses, we're also going to be looking at the math purely from each class's chassis. Although for this specific example, I don't think subclass would ultimately matter. Let's get back to some of the details we know. The cleric has an AC of 18, high health, and high damage output. The rogue only shoots and is less effective at it. By this, a conclusion we can draw is that the rogue is either hitting less often, dealing less damage, or both. Right out of the gate, as someone who has both played and DM'd 4 players who've played rogue, this can really sting. As mentioned before, rogue is a martial character. In the 2014 version of the game, especially if you're only using the player's handbook, their whole shtick is that they try to hit someone with a weapon and deal damage. However, unlike fighters or barbarians, a rogue also has a smaller hit die. It's actually the same as a cleric, it's a D8, meaning it's likely they have a similar hit point progression. However, a lot of rogue subclasses, like Arcane Trickster or Swashbuckler, also incentivize a player to prioritize a different secondary stat than Constitution. For Arcane Trickster, a player is recommended to have a higher intelligence, and for Swashbuckler, a higher charisma. I'm going to make another assumption here, one to demonstrate how even on a level playing field, there's going to be a gap in the game's math. That both players built their character using either a standard array or point buy. If these characters were generated by randomly rolling ability scores, the problem being experienced at the table is only worse. I actually remember a time I was playing in a campaign where we created characters that way. One player was playing a monk, and the 2 highest abilities that they rolled were dexterity and wisdom, both of which were +2. Another character was playing a warlock and had a +5 charisma. And let's just say, the monk player had a pretty miserable time of it. Again, assuming that this specific rogue and cleric were built using standard array or point buy, it's reasonable to assume that their primary stats, dexterity and wisdom respectively, both have a modifier of +4. Let's assume that both characters are still stuck with their first level starting equipment. The rogue is going to have leather armor, meaning that with a +4 dexterity, their AC is going to be 15. Even if they somehow picked up +1 armor or studded leather, it's only going to bump up to a 16. Clerics, on the other hand, start with either medium or heavy armor proficiency. If they're wearing something like scale mail, as long as the cleric player is conscientious about giving a +2 to their dex, their base AC is going to start at 16. Let's assume, though, that the cleric picked a subclass like life or war that grants them heavy armor proficiency. Well, they're going to start with chainmail, which again gives them a base AC of 16. And in addition, they get to start out with a shield. So 18 is fairly standard for a first level cleric. And there's no reason to think that that would change to level 5. Comparing a rogue's standard AC of 15 or 16 to a cleric's 18, that means the rogue has a 10 to 15% higher chance of getting hit. In fact, the whole cleric subclass heavy armor proficiency thing, leads a lot of casting players that are using sorcerers or wizards to take a 1-level multi-class dip into Cleric in order to just get that proficiency. So again, you're getting all the power benefits of a full caster with a really high armor class for a small investment. So what about damage? For the sake of argument, let's be generous and say our hypothetical rogue we're talking about is a wood elf, meaning they have a longbow proficiency. The reason for that is whether they're at range or in melee, they're either going to be using a longbow or a rapier, both of which have a D8 damage die. Again, if their dexterity modifier is a +4, the expected damage output of either of their weapons is going to be 8.5. The reason I'm not including sneak attack in there is just because that feature's trigger might be unreliable. I don't want to assume that the rest of the party is effectively setting up the rogue, which might be what's leading to some frustration. The cleric, meanwhile, in the current version of the game, has 2 cantrips that tend to get chosen often: Sacred Flame and Toll the Dead. Rather than roll an attack roll to hit an enemy's armor class, these cantrips force the target to make a saving throw, dexterity and wisdom respectively. Both of them have a starting damage die of 2d8 at 5th level. Toll the Dead eventually increases to 2d12 if the target is already hurt. Even this very little difference in options is already setting up the cleric for success. The rogue, as a weapon user, has to target the enemy's armor class, whereas the cleric can listen to the enemy's description from the DM and already start to strategize which might be a better cantrip to use. If the target is some lumbering brute, then maybe it doesn't have a super high dexterity save. Or if the target is, say, a minion that is under control from a big boss monster, they might have a lower wisdom. Assuming that these cantrips do hit, both of them, dealing 2d8, have an expected damage value of 9, versus the rogue's 8.5. Now, 0.5 can't be that big of a difference, can it? Even if we say that that difference is statistically negligible. What about their chances to hit? Well, that's going to be based on the monsters that they're fighting. As level 5 characters, let's say that they're fighting CR5 monsters. To use a variety from the basic rules, let's say that they're fighting an air elemental, boule, night hag, and otyugh. I picked these 4 in particular because they each have a distinct storytelling feel, and they do have different stat distributions and features. A brutish monstrosity like a boule is going to fight very differently than a scheming night hag. So how often are the rogue and cleric hitting each of these enemies? Well, first, the rogue likely has a +7 attack bonus with their weapon. Again, dexterity modifier is +4. At level 5, their proficiency bonus is +3, so +7. A cleric, meanwhile, is going to instead be forcing them to make saving throws, and their spell save DC is likely to be 15, 8 + 4 + 3. Let's start with the air elemental, which has an AC of 15, a dexterity modifier of +5, a wisdom modifier of +0, and no specific saving throw proficiencies. Oh, and it also has resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. With an attack bonus of +7, our rogue has a 65% chance of landing a blow on the elemental. If the cleric uses Sacred Flame, because it has a high dex score, the air elemental only has a 45% chance of getting hit. But again, it doesn't have a high wisdom. So if the cleric instead uses Toll the Dead, it has a 70% chance of hitting. And remember, if the air elemental already gets hit, those d8s turn to d12s. First, the cleric's Toll the Dead option has a 5% greater chance to hit than the rogue's weapon attack. Second, if the rogue lacks a magical weapon, it means that even if they do hit, that 8.5 expected damage is going to be halved, whereas Toll the Dead's necrotic damage goes all the way through. Now, I do want to point out that the commenter noted that they've been giving the rogue interesting items, and if one of these interesting items is a magical weapon, this damage resistant point is moot, But trust me, I've been at tables where the DM is stingy in giving out magic items, and all of the martial characters at the table were basically neutered, while the casters could freely cast whatever cantrips they want and do full damage. Let's move on to the Boule, which has an AC of 17 and a Dex and Wisdom modifier of +0. Our Rogue's chance to hit drops to 55%, while the Cleric's chance to hit with both cantrips lifts to 70. And if the Cleric uses Toll the Dead and the Boule is already hurt, its damage die increases from D8s to D12s. Again, the Cleric has a greater chance to hit, and when it does, it also is expected to deal more damage. So what about the Night Hag? Well, this one's going to be an interesting exception to the rule. Its AC is 17, like the Boule, but it also has a +2 Dexterity and Wisdom modifiers. Our Rogue's chance to hit stays at 55%, but unlike the Boule, both of the Cleric's cantrips only have a 60% chance to go off. That being said, the Night Hag also has the magic resistance feature, meaning that it has advantage on saving throws against spells and magical effects. From the research I've done, when it comes to factoring advantage and disadvantage, I usually count it as a plus or -4 to whatever the roll is. Assuming that this is correct, the chance of Sacred Flame and Toll the Dead to resolve actually drops down to 40%. So for once, the Rogue has a greater chance to hit than the Cleric. Again though, the Night Hag has damage resistance to non-magical, non-silvered bludgeoning, piercing, slashing damage. So if the Rogue doesn't have a specific weapon, they're still going to have their damage halved. And this is where the other side of casting comes into play. Even if the Cleric's cantrips don't have as likely a chance to hit as a weapon attack, the Cleric has support options they can pivot to. They can cast Bless or Shield of Faith. They have options that they can switch to still feel effective in a fight, whereas the Rogue is locked in the one thing that they can do over and over again. Not to mention that the Cleric, especially at level 5, can probably just switch to using a spell attack spell, like Guiding Bolt, which has an equal chance to hit as the Rogue, but if it hits, does significantly more damage. 4d6 radiant damage, which the Hag is not resistant to. And our final example is the Otyugh. It has an AC of 14, Dexterity of +0, and Wisdom of +1. Our Rogue has a 70% chance to hit, and because the Otyugh has a +0 Dexterity modifier, the Cleric's Sacred Flame's chance to hit is the same as the weapon attack. So, with the only exception being the Night Hag, we can see that for the most part, given the same roll, the Cleric is going to be hitting a little bit more often with a little bit more damage and a higher AC than the Rogue. And unlike the Cleric, who can pivot to different spells and strategies if their primary one doesn't work, the Rogue is stuck with an option that a lot of the times is likely not to work. All of this is to say that the commenters' frustration that they're feeling at the table has credence. Of course, again, there are dynamic elements we did not consider, such as the Air Elemental's Whirlwind attack or the Boule's Deadly Leap. However, in the grand scheme of things, especially if the Cleric has higher hit points than the Rogue, I'm not sure they would make a significant difference. All this said, I will say that when discussing the martial caster divide, Rogues and Clerics are both outliers in their respective categories. Of all the martial classes in the game, Rogue is the only one that does not get the extra attack feature at 5th level. Even the Monk, which in the 2014 version of the game is widely acknowledged to be the Rogue's mechanical inferior, gets extra attack. If we were talking about any other martial class besides the Rogue, our to hit and expected damage value calculations would be very different. Cleric is also an outlier when it comes to casters. Of all the full casters, it's the only one that gets heavy armor proficiency as part of its regular level progression, without taking a feat or multiclassing. Now, I'm not going to say that it's necessarily more powerful than, say, a bard or a wizard, but our ultimate concern isn't that the cleric is more powerful, it's that the cleric is stepping on the toes of another player character's role. The rogue, whose only shtick is trying to hit something and deal damage, is being outshone by another class that can not only do that better, but also has additional options it can pivot to. So what can we do to balance the scales? To go back to the original comment, all of the DM's instincts, despite being a new DM, are ones that I agree with. I do think it's a good idea to give items to the rogue that are specifically suited to that class, as well as set up situations where the rogue can shine, like disarming traps or picking locks or something. Now, they said they didn't want to exclude other players, and for this, I think it comes back to table agreements. At most tables I've been a part of that have had a healthy dynamic, there's usually an overt conversation where the different players acknowledge the roles that their characters bring to the table. Let's even say we're going to have a very traditional party composition: fighter, wizard, rogue, cleric. The players would acknowledge, let's let the rogue go in to disarm all the traps and pick the locks. That will be their time to shine. And if there isn't a rogue in the party, let's say we swap them for like a bard or a barbarian or something, well, when it comes to disarming those traps, it's not going to be as easy as if a rogue were in the party. They also have a legitimate point in that they don't want a player to be the favorite, which is a danger that can easily happen when you're distributing things like magic items as the DM. But also, doing nothing feels unfair. And that's true. That's the martial caster divide in action. If you as the DM aren't being aware of all of the imbalances that can creep in, then yes, doing nothing will basically have this cleric player feeling more powerful and the rogue player just feeling like they're not contributing. Which, to me anyway, doesn't sound like a lot of fun. At the end of the day, the instinct to talk with your players is the first thing that I would recommend. And specifically, why did they pick the class for the character that they're playing, and what do they hope to get out of it? I will say, to go back to Rogue, that famous YouTube optimizer Treant Monk recently did a huge comprehensive breakdown, ranking all 13 core classes in 5th edition as they are now. Of all 13 classes, Rogue came in 12th. That largely has to do with its combat potential. But I will say, one of my favorite campaigns I was able to participate in was a very social interaction heavy game, where in the story world, casters were discriminated against, meaning that characters that played casters in combat could potentially be stronger, but they'd often hide their magical abilities for fear of the social interaction ramifications. In a game like that, my rogue, which had an expertise in perception and insight, often got to shine. And yes, in certain combat situations, they weren't the best one to go to, but I still felt like a meaningful contributor to the team. And I often look at Rogue with rose-colored glasses because of that good experience. Again, not all the classes are created equal, but some that perform better in the combat pillar of play, depending on the agreements and the story of the world, may not fit in as well as other classes that can contribute more in those pillars. Now that being said, it was also apparent that this level 5 campaign is combat oriented, which does narrow our focus a little bit, but also allows for more specific solutions. Here are some that you might want to try out. First, consider your monster tactics. If the cleric is such an obvious threat, combat after combat, or even they open up with some big move that deals a lot of damage, well, your enemy is going to prioritize who they're going to attack very differently. If the cleric makes it very obvious that they're super powerful, they're going to get targeted. Even with an AC of 18, if you're taking like 6 or 7 oncoming attack rolls, some of them are going to hit. And especially if the cleric is concentrating on a spell, like, I don't know, Bless or Spirit Guardians. Well, each time they get hit, they're going to have a chance that that spell effect is going to be wasted. Again, just make it super clear that if you do end up targeting this cleric, that it's from a roleplay story place, not because you're picking on them. And if another character presents themselves as a bigger threat, like say a hypothetical wizard or fighter, then you move your target to them. This gets your players much more engaged and dynamic in their decision making when it comes to combat. On the subject of encounter design, you might want to consider adding in more enemies. I picked CR5 creatures to demonstrate what commonly happens at the table. But let's say you've got one big enemy with a chunky armor class, and a whole lot of minions with an AC of maybe 11 or 12, the rogue can pick off some of the minions while the cleric focuses on the big bad guy. Especially playing Baldur's Gate 3 recently, the difference between easier and more difficult encounter design often comes to the amount of units on the board. Vary up your terrain a little bit. One of the rogue's iconic features is cunning action and their ability to hide as a bonus action. Depending on how you rule it, this can make the rogue an unseen attacker and give them advantage on their attack rolls. Like we talked about earlier, if we consider advantage-disadvantage as a 4-point bump towards or against a d20 roll, this means if the rogue has advantage on their attacks, not only do they not have to rely on their allies to set up sneak attack, but they're essentially gaining a 20% chance to hit. If it's an enemy like the Night Hag, this means that instead of 55, they have a 75% chance to hit. Significantly greater, and if they have a magical weapon, they don't have to worry about the damage resistance. You can play with effects like line of sight. Like what happens if there's a thin fog that's lightly obscuring the area? Or if your character is a wood elf or halfling, the current version of the 2014 rules has specific circumstances in those two options that allow a rogue to hide. It might even be that the rogue, if they're a halfling, hides behind the cleric and shoots unseen from between their feet or something, increasing their chance to hit and also allowing their sneak attack to do more damage. And one thing I forgot to mention with advantage is you're also doubling your chance to crit. The most memorable rogue moments at the table for me were when the rogue hit and they got to double all of their sneak attack die. The more often the rogue specifically can gain advantage, the more likely they make this huge memorable play where even if they're technically one of the weaker classes, they can still make a player feel really good about choosing them. Last, if you really want to show the value of a rogue, hit them with some intelligence saves. A cleric might have a high AC, they might have a high wisdom save. Very rarely do clerics have a strong intelligence save, which is one of the saving throw proficiencies you get as a rogue. Spells like Mind Sliver or Tasha's Mind Whip can quickly get your party to appreciate the rogue's contribution. Now, those are all non-homebrew encounter design type solutions to help your rogue feel more valuable. But what if we do look at more variant homebrew-like solutions? The first, because the commenter mentioned that the rogue is shooting, give the rogue some fun, tricky ammunition. Maybe they have an acid arrow that they shoot, and if they hit, it splashes the enemy with more damage and it deals persistent damage, eats away at their armor or something. Or maybe if the rogue misses, the acid still splashes on them and does a little bit of damage even though they didn't hit. Maybe they fire a blinding arrow that flashes in the target's face whether they hit or not. The target has to succeed a Constitution save or be blinded, which increases their chance to hit on subsequent turns. Maybe the best thing to do is to offer the rogue a rebuild. Say 4 levels of rogue, 1 level of fighter. First, this gives them proficiency in medium armor, which might help their armor class, like if they find a breastplate or something. But more importantly, that first level gives them the archery fighting style. It is a flat +2 bonus to attack rolls made with ranged weapons. So again, if this rogue is an archer type, that's a 10% greater chance that they're going to land the target. Again, looking at the stat blocks that were the most difficult to hit for our rogue, which had an AC of 17, the rogue may start now with a 55% chance to hit. Archery on top of it would increase it to 65. Advantage would increase it to 85. On that note, this last recommendation is probably the one that's the most contentious. In the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide on page 252, there's a variant rule called facing. This rule is one I use at my tables, and it definitely made my combats way more dynamic. Basically, you have to track which direction each token on the grid is facing, and the opposite direction, its rear arc, is considered unseen. Because of this, martial characters that rely on weapon attacks can sneak to the rear arc and fire, get advantage. Most casters, like our example Cleric, often use saving throws instead. So this helps bridge the martial caster divide a little bit, but specifically for rogues, it allows them to embody their iconic playstyle. Get to the opponent's back, hit them harder than you would if you were facing the front. I do acknowledge that this will make your combats a little bit more complex. A lot of players don't like combats getting this granular, and it might take them a little while to get on board. But I found that it greatly increased my table's level of satisfaction with their tactics and combat decisions, as well as prompt them to have better descriptions in combat, so it actually made the story a lot more compelling. So those are some of my suggestions for this commenter. What do you think about these recommendations? And was there anything I missed when it comes to bridging the martial caster divide? Are there specific topics with your games that you'd like my feedback on? If there are, let me know in the comments down below. Hit like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. And have an awesome day, everybody. Bye-bye now.